Hello again, higher biologist, Mr. Kinnear here with another video lesson for higher biology. We're in Unit 3, Sustainability and Interdependence, and we're looking at Key Area 3.2, which is plant and animal breeding. So here is where we're at in Unit 3. We've already looked at food supply and plant growth and productivity, or photosynthesis, and plant and animal breeding, which we're on just now, fits into that. Obviously, it is important for food security. And we'll also look at crop protection and animal welfare, which again feed into those things. And then we'll look at the kind of interactions with symbiosis, social behaviour, and biodiversity. So artificial selection is something where we've evolved a wide variety of crops and domestic animals through selective breeding and hybridisation. So that's us, humans getting involved in selecting animals and selecting plants to breed together. And we've been doing that for thousands of years. So the crops that we use, the animals that we use, have not just randomly come about. We have bred them together successfully in order to produce our things like high yield barley, oats, maize, cotton, all those things, as well as dairy cows and meat cows. So we produce these cultivars are a cultivated variety. So those are particular groups of plant and animals selected for desired characteristics, and they're easily propagated, easily reproduced. So selective breeding is about taking an organism or organisms with the traits that you want for your purposes and breeding them together. And that produces obviously a huge amount of variety. A great example of that is dogs. All of our dogs came from wolves, and we've taken them over the millennia and bred them together to get the characteristics that we want. And again, we've done that for the dogs who do different jobs. So greyhounds and lurchers were designed to run alongside horses, and they're still apparently very good companions for horses. And you've got other kind of terriers to go down holes and chase out different organisms, different animals, and you've got retrievers, all those kind of things who are designed or bred to do those kind of jobs. Nowadays, you do have these kind of selective breeding of things like a Labradoodle, which is hypoallergenic. You've got these designer handbag dogs, which again are selectively bred to get them small things. So again, we've managed to do that for jobs, but we've also managed to do that for looks as well. So other examples of selective breeding when it comes to things like agriculture. So we've got the Auroch, which is the original type of cattle, and we've selectively bred them to produce things like Holstein or Jersey cows, which have high milk production, and the Aberdeen Angus, and other examples for its muscle mass, therefore its beef, because obviously when we're eating beef, we're eating the muscle. So you wouldn't really want to eat a Holstein, and again, you wouldn't really want to milk the Aberdeen Angus. So they're bred specifically for their different productions. So high quality and high volume of milk from things like Holstein or Jersey cows. And again, that muscle mass you can see just even on that animal, Aberdeen Angus, has a huge muscle mass. So obviously then produces lots of nice meat. Horses have been a huge part of our agricultural history. So equids would have been the kind of origin. We've bred them to produce things like Clydesdale for strength and stamina. So before we had tractors, you'd have Clydesdale horses being able to pull ploughs, carts, payloads, etc. And on the other side, you've got Arabian horses, which are bred for speed. You wouldn't want an Arabian horse pulling your plough, it wouldn't work out particularly well. If you've ever seen the film War Horse, that actually happens, where the lead character has what becomes the war horse in his farm, trying to get it to pull a plough up a hill, and it doesn't work out particularly well for either of them. There's huge examples when it comes to plants for crops, but an easy one would be wild cabbage, which has been selectively bred to produce things like broccoli. So these are the flowers of the wild cabbage that have been selectively bred, producing other things like Brussels sprouts and cauliflower. So the same original species bred just slightly different to produce these different food products. And the same can be said for a huge amount of different crops such as maize and barley and oats and all these kind of things which have been selectively bred across the millennia. So selective breeding is about taking organisms with similar genetic information and we're inbreeding them. So we're putting those two things together. That then forms a huge amount of homozygosity. What on earth is that? Well, you've heard the word homozygous, homozygous being having two alleles which are exactly the same. So homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. So they have then a huge amount of genes where the alleles are identical on each chromosome. But this comes with problems. So for instance, few genetic differences can lead to the consequence of low tolerance to changing conditions, so little ability to adapt to changes in the environment. You also get that increased chance of harmful combinations, so more hereditary diseases. So here's some examples of inbreeding problems. The first one I'm quite familiar with, hip problems in Labradors. When you buy your Labrador puppy from a reputable breeder, then you'll get the hip scores from mother and father, which will give you an indication of hopefully the lack of future problems you'll have with the hips in your lab. If you go to a dodgy breeder, then you might not get the hip score, or you might get poor hip scores, which will show you that you may end up with problems in the future and some huge vet bills. And that comes from breeding close relatives, so mothers with sons, fathers with daughters, that kind of thing. And that might help you get good looking labs, but it might end up with some problems. You've also got problems like deafness in Dalmatians. And a human one, the VIGOUR tribe in Zimbabwe, they've got two-toed feet. So again, they come from a very small area. So you'll find that your marriages, etc., will be from very close relatives. And unfortunately, because of that very small gene pool, then they have developed this problem with two-toed feet. Other examples in thoroughbred horses, broken bones and reproductive issues. So again, people are taking horses that obviously run incredibly fast, win races, and then they will breed them very closely together, which will get fast horses, but obviously does come with its problems and issues. Outbreeding is then the opposite. So you're getting the fusion of gametes from unrelated members of the same species, genetically diverse members. And you can get that naturally through wild animals and cross-pollinated plants. So things like tomatoes, sugar beets, and maize. And they can do that process by having different times for their anthers and ovaries ripening. So you won't get pollen moving from the anther to the stamen within the same flower because they won't be ripe at the same time. So you're more likely to get the pollen going to a different flower and therefore cross-pollination rather than self-pollination. And that then promotes heterozygosity, so you're more likely to get different alleles of your genes because of this cross-pollination or this outbreeding capability. So backcross might be an example of this outbreeding opportunity. So inbreeding can't do it indefinitely because of the problems associated with it. So you might do this backcrossing to incorporate an acquired gene from a parent while maintaining some other desired features. And that is then crossing an F1 hybrid with one of its parents or with a genetically identical individual. And we'll look at F1 hybrids in the next slide. An F1 hybrid come about by crossing two different strains to re-establish the heterozygosity. So an example here with pansies, we've got one parent which is homozygous for 4 different traits, and we're going to cross it with another pansy, which again is homozygous for all 4 traits, but it is recessive where the other is dominant and dominant where the other is recessive. So we therefore get this F1 hybrid, which is heterozygous for all 4 of these characteristics. Plant breeders and farmers often maintain these inbreed varieties so they can breed together to form these F1 hybrids. So in this example, pansies, breeders to sell to um, garden centres, etc., or directly to the public. They won't sell the parents, but they will sell, obviously, the daughter or the offspring. And they are then better looking than either the parents and sell for more money. Now, these F1 hybrids display what's known as hybrid vigour. They're generally bigger, more productive, and they have better disease resistance than their parents. They also are the same, so they therefore produce a uniform crop and will have a higher yield, which is obviously really useful when we're growing plants for food. An example there, two parents of maize or corn. Um, you wouldn't particularly like either parent if you were picking out corn in the shops, but that F1 hybrid, which is say, heterozygous for each of the characteristics we're looking for, therefore clearly looks bigger, better, and more appetizing. So it has a higher yield and therefore has a lot better potential for the growers. You're then very careful about which animals or plants you use for breeding because many of our bedding plants and farm animals and crops are F1 hybrids. So that's great. They're incredibly productive for what you want from them, but they're not great for breeding because you then get a huge amount of variety within the offspring. So whether it's that maize, the pansies, or this example of delphinium, you have the parents there for breeding, and you sell or use the hybrids, which will have that hybrid vigour, and it has the characteristics you want, but you really don't want to be then breeding those. You just want to keep the parents there for continual breeding to get the right characteristics in your F1 hybrids. So artificial selection and the processes we've been using for millennia are fantastic. They've produced a huge amount of benefits. It is, however, a slow process and involves an element of chance through that fertilization process, through bringing in potential dangerous combinations as well as the desired combinations. So obviously we've talked about genetic engineering in previous units. So genetic engineering obviously is a potential solution so that we can modify the DNA or insert new genes to give new characteristics in a lot more tailored and precise way than you can do with just breeding two organisms together. So we can isolate DNA, which you again know about from previous lessons, and take it and insert it into another different species. So there's a few particular areas where we've done this. But again, this obviously comes with some pushback. So genetically modified foods are not huge. They're not really out there in the general domain, despite the fact that they could be revolutionary in terms of feeding the population and increasing the food security. There's a huge amount of pushback from people who we don't understand the science, where we don't understand the benefits that it could provide, and just kind of label this kind of idea of Franken foods and have these scare stories about them. So there is definitely some developments happening that are being stalled by this fear of science. One of these examples of genetic engineering is glyphosate. Glyphosate is a widely available herbicide, weed killer. Effectively, it will kill plants, particularly weeds you're going to target. It's used by farmers and gardeners to control weeds. And again, even that chemical itself has a huge amount of ethical pushback, where people are labeling it as carcinogenic, causes cancer. And again, there's a huge amount of studies which show it clearly doesn't, or doesn't do it any more than, say, you know, a glass of alcohol would, but there's still a big issue around it. However, it is widely used around the world. What people have been able to do is actually take a resistance to that herbicide, the glyphosate, take that gene and insert it into things like soy, maize, alfalfa, canola, and sorghum. So they then have a resistance to that herbicide, so they will not die when they are sprayed with glyphosate herbicide. That then gives an advantage because your farmer can spray your fields without damaging the crop, allowing farmers to get rid of the weeds without harming their crop. And again, that then potentially leads to some people having a problem that their food is then potentially tainted with glyphosate. So that's another pushback on that issue. But effectively, what we do have is a way of targeting the weeds which are causing us problems and allowing us to grow more crops in our fields. So as of 2013, so that's a wee while back, 90% of the soybean fields are planted with glyphosate resistant varieties. So they can then, as I say, be sprayed. No damage to the soybean, but all the rest of the weeds are killed off when sprayed. Another example of genetic engineering is Bt toxin. So that's produced normally by a bacteria. It binds the receptors in the guts of insects once it's activated, and it kills them, which is obviously then a good pesticide. So genetic engineering allows for us to take that gene from the bacteria and give it to plants, give it to crop plants. Therefore, our crops now have an inbuilt toxin, an inbuilt pesticide within them. So the plant cells themselves are producing this toxin, which is normally produced by bacteria. And that means then we have a pest-resistant crop. So obviously caterpillars or whatever comes along, eats a bit of the plant, and then they die off. So they have an inbuilt insect resistance within really good value crops. So we've got things like Bt, maize, so again, corn as we know it, cotton. They're widely grown in several countries, so they have within them that toxin which kills off the pests without having to spray them with chemicals. And that's us for today. So today we've looked at this process of selective breeding, which humans have been doing for millennia. Before we knew about genetics, we just took animals or plants that had good characteristics and we bred them with a similar animal or plant with good characteristics. And the good thing is we got maybe even better plant or animal from the end of that. But it was still hit and miss, still a bit random, but it has produced the plants and animals that feed us today. Problems that can occur are through inbreeding, so by breeding organisms that are too closely related on a regular basis. We've seen that example with dogs, and you may be familiar with some problems that your dog may have or similar dogs may have, because that's quite common in terms of inbreeding when it's producing pedigree animals like dogs. We gave other examples of the two toad tribe from Zimbabwe. But you can overcome those issues with outbreeding, so increasing the genetic pool or hybrids. And lastly, we talked about genetic engineering, so we can provide a more tailored and specific approach to producing better quality crops. And as I touched on towards the end, that does still have its problems because people don't understand the science, don't believe the science, or just have a fear about the unknown. And this kind of label of Frankenfoods, of people coming out there and just genetically modifying things and people not understanding that. But it can provide a far more superior or tailored approach to some of the issues we have with food security as we go forward. So that's me. Hopefully that has been informative and engaging. If you have any problems, questions or queries, also let me know and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.